Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Happy New Year. Welcome to the fourth Marshall Lecture. And I'm here not to take up much time or oxygen, but to remind you that you're in a series of lectures, rather than in lots of unlinked lectures. And I just thought I would remind you of a few of the threads that have emerged in the last three. And I'm going to pick slightly at random some phrases that you lent on at the question sessions of our lecture series. You asked us to be on the ground, okay, when we're trying to fix things. You asked us, or asked yourselves, to be humble enough to co-create the solutions for the problems that you find. You thought that using your 80,000 hours wisely would be a good way to become philanthropists in your own right. You thought about whether your actions would crowd in or crowd out effective action. You wondered how effective altruism might be. And you were reminded that the arc of history is long and it bends towards humility. I'm not going to introduce our distinguished speaker. I'm going to remind you that our next two lectures are on the 24th and the 31st. Keep your eye on our website in case there is a last-minute change of venue, though next Tuesday we should revert to our more normal home across the street. No, I beg your pardon. Next Tuesday, we will be in exactly the same place as we are this Tuesday. Julian.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. I'm Julian Le Grand, and I'm chairing this session. And it's a great privilege to be able to chair a lecture given by Sir Paul Marshall. He's actually one of the most remarkable figures of our age, I would say. He's a chief investment officer, but more importantly, co-founder of Marshall Wace, the global hedge fund, running at about $27 billion, managing about $27 billion worth of funds. Of particular interest for our purposes, he's also, though, a founding trustee of ARC, the children's charity, and chairman of ARC Schools, the Multiple Academy Trust, one of the major, or perhaps the major, and one of the most successful multi-academy trusts. In 2000, a year ago, he founded, and of great interest to us, he founded the Marshall Institute, along with co-founder of Sir Tom Hughes Hallett. And indeed, the Marshall Institute is, of course, the reason why we are here today. He is a political activist. He was very prominent in the Leave campaign for Brexit, and he's very happy to take questions on that if required. But I think more importantly, he's a public intellectual, somebody who participates in the social, political, and intellectual environment of our society and our country, and contributes massively to that. He was knighted in Her Majesty's Birthday Honours in June 2016, and he holds an MBA from INSEAD and a BA from St John's College, Oxford. He's the author of several books, but fundamentally he is a venture philanthropist, and he's going to talk to us about venture philanthropy in action. Paul.
Thank you, Julian. Yes, the mic's working. Having attended the last lecture, I was admiring Nava's footwork, and I've been planning to have a stage where I can move around and kind of address different parts of the audience dynamically. And somehow you managed to shackle me with a whole set of furniture. Makes it pretty much impossible.
We'll dispose of it.
Yeah. I was, as Julian said, I was at Oxford. I always would have preferred to be at LSE. My sister was LSE about 3 years after me. She had a great time here. And I preferred it because it was much more international. much less public school dominated, and much more for me a school of the future. And that was confirmed to me when Tom and I decided to set up this institute, because we went to, and I'm going to try and walk up and down again, we went to all the universities. We had the idea. We went to all the universities, the top universities in Britain. So we went to Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, LSE, University of London, and
I'm going to sit out of your way, I think.
move the chairs, please. And when Tom went to Oxford and saw the Vice-Chancellor and laid out the plans, and the Vice-Chancellor said, that's terribly interesting, Sir Tom, but I'm not convinced that philanthropy is a respectable subject for academic study. And the former director of LSE, Craig Calhoun, when we met him, he told us that exactly the same thing happened in 1897. The Webbs, first of all, took their project to Oxford, and it was rejected on the grounds that economics was not yet, or not a subject for academic study, even though it was at least 100 years since Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. So Oxford was behind the times then, and they're behind the times now. And we're very pleased that LSE is with the times, and that we've been able to form this wonderful partnership. What I want to do today is basically talk about my philanthropic journey, so a bit of practice, and then talk about the lessons that I have learned, just a few lessons that I've learned from it. So a bit of a story first, and then some thoughts. My personal journey in philanthropy stroke charity began when I was at college, and when I went to a Tier Fund presentation, and I decided to give a standing order to Tier Fund at about £10 a month, and it lasted for a number of years. I didn't know much about Tier Fund. I still don't know very much about Tier Fund, but it just was it impressed me. It was a good presentation, and it was a faith-based commitment. And then a few years later, I lost my faith, so I cancelled the standing order. And after that, there were a few years when I did kind of random, occasional gifts, but nothing of any substance. And then Marshall Wace started to be successful, and we started to make money. And what happened then was that, first of all, it was easier to give because there was some money around. But more important, people started approaching us, and we started getting lots of phone calls, nice letters. Would you like to come to dinner with minor royalty and so on? And we went to these various dinners, terribly flattered. And at the end of the dinner, they made a pitch. And we just felt, because we'd been invited to dinner, we had to be polite. And so we made a donation. This is my partner in Wace and I. And pretty soon, we got very frustrated with this, because actually it was very unsatisfactory. We couldn't follow through. We didn't know exactly what the charities were doing. Typically, they were the largest, most obvious charities. And so in 2001, there were a group of us, essentially hedge fund managers and fund of fund managers, in an organization which at the time was called TACT, which was an organization which had been set up to run the annual prize-giving, kind of Oscars for hedge funds. And we said, well, there's no point doing an Oscars dinner. Why don't we actually turn this into a charity dinner? And we renamed it and called it ARC, which stands for Absolute Return for Kids. And we wanted to try and apply the business disciplines and the innovation that we had tried to bring to hedge funds into the world of venture philanthropy. And we started off by still making donations to a small number of charities, but they were charities that we really got to know and tried to understand. But even that was actually very frustrating. And so then we said, well, actually, let's try and think about really difficult problems that we could try and solve. And the first of those was HIV. This was 2002, 2003. And it was a time when Mbeki in South Africa still did not acknowledge the link between HIV and AIDS. We went to South Africa, and we came up with a solution, or a model, which we negotiated with Western Cape Province. And what we did was we worked with local state clinics. This is a state clinic. And we basically developed an antiretroviral program for the mothers of the children. Because we were a children's charity, how could we help the children? We wanted to prevent AIDS being transmitted to the children. We wanted to heal the mothers. Now, as any of you have looked at, know the AIDS problem well, the biggest issue in AIDS and HIV treatment is adherence. If you start the medicine and stop, you're worse off than if you'd never had the medicine at all. So what we had to do is to find people in the community who would work with us as partners to make sure there was adherence to the program. And we developed a network of what we called archangels, who are volunteers, who are basically mothers, who dedicated their lives to making sure all the people who came on the program stayed on the program. And we got up to, we did 200,000 people were tested, 20,000 people were put on antiretroviral drugs. And then in about 2007-8, we became independent from us, and they were the first big program of its kind in Africa, and I think it's pretty much the largest. There are 200,000 adherents to the program now, and across the whole of South Africa. And so it's something we're very proud of. This is somebody testing for the virus. And these are some of the children who benefited. The second thing we did was in Romania. I don't know if anybody here from Romania or Eastern Europe? No, nobody. Yes, you're from Romania? Bulgaria. Oh, well, we went to Bulgaria afterwards. Some of you will know that the communist regimes didn't like families. The families were an alternative source of authority to the state. And therefore they weren't particularly keen on the bond between children and families. So they encouraged parents to give away the children who were inconvenient, whether they had handicaps or they were just unwanted children. So they developed across communist countries huge networks, or not even networks, just huge numbers of children in orphanages. And Romania had 100,000 children in state orphanages. They look a bit like this is one of the state orphanages. And if you visited the orphanage, visiting one of those orphanages was the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. The thing I most remember is the smell. But when you went in there, you had a lot of children who had been tied up in beds and cots for large parts of their life. So I can remember having a 15-year-old boy who, in my arms, had to hold like this, and his arms were like this because he'd never been able to flex them, so they'd become completely sclerotic. And his legs were also bent under him, and he couldn't control his bowel movements. So, and this was a 16-year-old child, and so what we did is we developed a program where we funded the creation of foster homes. So we funded the building of new foster homes and creation of foster families, which would take between 6 and 10 children at a time, and take them out of the orphanages and give them a family life. This is the inside of one of the orphanages, and you can see a lot of those children had mental disorder issues. Some of them, of course, were handicapped before they came to the orphanages, but a huge number of them became mentally unwell because of their treatment in the orphanages, and it was a horror. In the end, we got 20,000 children out of orphanages in Maramureș, which is the northernmost county of Romania. But the overall problem was too big for ourselves, because it's very expensive to build all these foster homes. So we ended up turning into, very actively advocating with the EU to do something about it. And actually one of the great things the EU has done is they made a condition, some would say the few things, but great things, Andres. The conditions of membership for Romania and Bulgaria was to sort out the orphanage issue. So today in Romania there's still 20,000 children in orphanages, but 80,000 have been taken out into smaller family homes. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the ARC journey is the UK education. For 3 or 4 years after we were founded, we didn't do very much in the UK, and the reason was because we wanted to get the maximum bang for our buck in terms of the impact globally of a dollar spent. And clearly, you can make a much bigger difference financially with your money in Africa than you can in the UK. And so what led us eventually to really commit very heavily to the UK was the government academies program, where because they offered to match and more than match what you gave, it suddenly made our money, our pound, go a very long way. And this was we first started thinking about it 2002, which is when legislation was passed to introduce academies. And the academies were introduced just for the most disadvantaged children, disadvantaged schools in the country, and the ones which had the worst management and the worst results. And we knew nothing about education. And we went to find out who did it best in the world. And that's always a good model in business or in philanthropy. You don't know how to do something, find the person who does it best and copy them. And in this world, plagiarism is only a good thing. And so we went to the US, which had created the charter school movement, and there were at that time 4 or 5 great chains, and we spent time in those chains, and we basically copied the principles of those chains and introduced them in the schools that we started in the UK. To give you one example of how counterintuitive that could be, in KIPP, which is the most well-known American academy chain, they start every class with a mantra. I vow to do my best to fulfill my potential, whatever the mantra is. Every class, and that's very un-British. And so we looked at it, but it's part of the system. So we said, well, let's have a go. And we took it to our schools, and every class starts with a mantra. And it works. And a couple of years later, we got to know and actually hired Michael Wilshaw, who became the head of Ofsted, who ran the most successful school in the country called Mossbourne. And Michael Wilshaw and Mossbourne used to be Hackney Downs, which is the worst performing secondary school in Britain. And he took that school in 5 or 10 years to a point where 10 pupils a year go to Oxbridge. And part of what he did was the mantra. It's the only other place in Britain where we found the same approach, which was using this mantra. I mean, obviously there are lots of other things as well. But the point is, good practice, where you see it, and you can import it, export it, and generally speaking, it works. I'm getting on to lessons learned, but now I'm going to do that properly. And I'm going to talk about 4 things, 4 lessons that I've learned from that journey. The first is the difference between charity and philanthropy. Of course, the first difference is that charity has a Latin origin and philanthropy has a Greek origin. Charity, they both mean almost the same thing, but not quite. Charity means love in Latin. If you go to 1 Corinthians in the Bible, with a great passage about love, in the King James Version, actually, in the modern version, it says faith, hope, and love. In the end, there are these things remain: faith, hope, and love. In the King James, it's faith, hope, and charity, and I always find that rather difficult because it has a different meaning now. But I think 500 years ago, it had almost the same meaning. And there was a confusion about whether it meant love as an act or love as a feeling. And that confusion, I think, is still there in terms of the meaning of charity. Philanthropy, the origin is Aeschylus. In the play Prometheus Bound, when Prometheus gives the gift of fire to humankind. And it means in the Greek, love of humankind. But over time, the meanings of the 2 words have diverged, so that charity is essentially an act of the heart without anything else attached. And philanthropy is about working together with the recipient. So the giving of the fire is actually giving us, humankind, something that we can work with so that we can make ourselves better and we can become more self-reliant. And this is a nice summary of it. Daniel Gilman was an American philanthropist. Charity gives temporary relief for the needy. Philanthropy maximizes human potential by creating and supporting institutions to deliver individual and civic improvement. So my first step, the Tier Fund donation, that was charity. There was definitely no philanthropy involved in that. They may have been philanthropists, but what I was doing was charity. But as I've gone along on my journey, I've become more and more of a philanthropist. And then that brings me to the second lesson. Philanthropy is about working with assets, working with the assets that are there in the community. If you look at government welfare programs, they essentially work with what you might call a deficit model. Governments work out what is missing, what is a problem in a community, and they fill the problem with central funding, normally with money, but it's essentially deficit-based. They don't say what are the assets that we can work with to solve this problem. Whereas philanthropy essentially says, I want to help, I've got some money, who can I work with, what are the assets here that I can use to make this situation better? It's all of, one way you could say it's about the difference between Marvin Gaye and Lenin. Marvin Gaye said, what's going on? Lenin said, what is to be done? And that's that. And so I'm more of a Marvin Gaye guy than a Lenin guy. And if you think of examples in South Africa, if you go back to the picture, well, we identified local assets. There were the clinics. Government clinics. We didn't have to pay for those clinics. They were there. We said to the government, can we put somebody into your clinic so that we can use your asset and we can just use that space and do the work to treat the virus? And we went to the community and we found the archangels, the people who were going to help us with the adherence. They were also assets. So we were working with what was there. And in all the best philanthropy, you're working with local assets. And as you look around in a community today, the main assets in any community in developed worlds typically are the schools and faith-based communities. Those are the kind of prime assets. And I'm a great believer, for example, that the church has an immense network of assets because it's a great repository of altruism. And if you could harness those assets even more than we are today, you can make a huge difference. So finding the assets and using them, and working with them is absolutely key. Third issue, motivation. This has been a big theme in the previous 3 lectures, and so I want to say a few words about it. And we heard a lot from Nava last time about pure and impure altruism. Many of you will know, and if you don't, I'm going to introduce you to Maimonides. I've only ever read about Maimonides, so I don't know how to pronounce the name. So I would have said Maimonides, but apparently for an American, it's Maimonides. And he was a Jewish rabbi in Spain in the 12th century. And he developed a hierarchy of giving. What are the key... and this is his ranking, okay? If this was I love this, if this was completely interactive, you could spend a whole class or a series just on this. I mean, this is a fascinating set of criteria. And, if you all looked at it, if I had time, I'd ask each of you to write down what your hierarchy would be in each of these 8 statements. giving begrudgingly and making the recipient feel disgraced or embarrassed. I've definitely done that. I mean, when you pass somebody begging on the streets, we've all been in that situation. Do we always give? When we give, how well do we do it? I mean, that's absolutely, it's familiar to all of us. Certainly familiar to me. I would certainly put number 4, giving before you're asked. That's high up for me, because that's just an act of impulsive generosity, which I'm always very moved by. And then the highest would not be my highest. The highest, giving money or a loan or time, whatever else it takes to enable an individual to be self-reliant. Yes, that's good, but actually giving on, but not without the person knowing, is clearly a better thing, because you're taking out your ego. And I know when I give, my ego is intimately involved in the process, and I wish it wasn't. And so I would put into the hierarchy something about, right at the top, taking your ego out of it, but I fail woefully on that scale. But anyway, I saw one of you take a photo of this. It's maybe something that you can take away with those things and think about them. But the really important thing I wanted to say about this is that, in a way, it doesn't matter what your motivation is. I don't think we should torture ourselves about our motivation, provided we do it. You shouldn't be torturing your conscience, saying, what are my motives? Is there ego in this? Am I trying to control this person? Do they know who I am? Do I know who they are? Ultimately, if you're trying to make a difference to people's lives, the important thing is making a difference to those lives in the right way. But motivation matters in another way, which is it matters enormously in understanding your co-workers and their incentives and how they think about and how they're motivated by the giving process. And this is something that Nava touched on last time, but I want to emphasize it even more, because I had a very interesting conversation after Nava's lecture with one of the students. You are all taught within a framework which kind of is anchored in terms of economics in Adam Smith, Rational Self-Interest, 1776, which is an assumption about human behavior, and that we essentially operate on the basis of rational self-interest. Now, we all know that actually that's a falsifying assumption. People are not always self-interested. Actually, they often act by altruism, by idealism, by a sense of justice, by all kinds of motives which you cannot ascribe to self-interest. Furthermore, we're not rational. Pascal understood this long before Adam Smith falsified the human nature. We are, most of the time, we are irrational. We have cognitive biases. Danny Kahneman, Amos Tversky have changed the profession of economics in the last 10, 20 years, but they have introduced an understanding of behavior and psychology into a discipline which is still anchored in this falsifying premise. So it's like you build a very good branch on a tree, but the trunk of the tree is still rooted in a falsifying assumption. And of course, and every business school teaches this stuff. Every college, almost every CFO, every CEO has been trained in this stuff. Ayn Rand, preached this stuff. Alan Greenspan worshipped at the floor. He used to sit and listen to Ayn Rand as if she was a seer. Paul Ryan, he believes all this stuff. It is absolutely impregnated in the leadership of our Western societies, and it's basically at the very least falsifying. And that's a problem when you get to charity and philanthropy, because actually the people who work in the charitable sector are not driven by self-interest. They're primarily driven by altruism, idealism. They want to make a difference. And so one of the things we want to do at the Marshall Institute, one of the key things, and it's NAVA's role, is to develop a model of change, a way of thinking about how organizations work, which is not based on self-interest, but it's based on altruism. And I think we can change the world with this. I genuinely think we can challenge the whole spectrum of thought around human behavior in places other than the private sector. Julian did a huge amount of work on incentives, particularly for the state sector. Basically, we have to develop a way of thinking about what motivated every individual working inside a charity, other than self-interest, which is not their first priority. Next thing I want to talk about is the opportunity today in philanthropy. I think Zoltan Axe is one of yours. LSE. Anybody know Zoltan Axe? Sorry? Yeah, he was here. He was. Oh, he's not. Okay, on Wikipedia, he's still here. Anyway, he said, I think it's a great quote, philanthropists are innovators of opportunity, looking to where society is most in need, to where they can have the biggest impact and create networks, institutions to achieve these goals. That's a great quote for me because it really sums it up very well and very strategically. And I think that never has there been such a great moment for philanthropy. Why do I say that? Well, the 20th century, and this is a simplification, but the 20th century was all about the state saying that there are certain parts of human life where the private sector is not adequately providing, particularly health and education. So the state has to step in and make sure that everybody has equal access to the same health services, the same education services, and make sure it's fairly done and equally distributed. And in many ways, that was a great step forward. But we're now reaching the point where the state's frontiers seem to be very limited. The states are running out of money everywhere. And also we're seeing the insufficiency of delivery in a large part, in significant areas of state provision. So there is a moment now when I think that, and you're seeing it, the state is going to ask the voluntary sector to step in and deliver many of the things that the state have done. The state will fund it, the state will guarantee equal and fair access, the state will inspect, but volunteers will deliver. And this has actually happened in this country. We have had in this country one of the most radical, bold, and exciting reforms that the world has seen. It's absolutely landmark, which is effectively saying, with the education system, this education system is now going to be funded by the state, supervised by the state, but it's going to be delivered by the voluntary sector. That is a very historic moment. 100 years ago, 1902, Balfour Education Act, the state nationalized education because it was too uneven. Effectively, the state said, we're going to provide everything. 2002, 100 years later, through Andrew Adonis, the academies started the process of change, which is now halfway through, but on the road to completion, of handing the entire education system to the voluntary sector. That is very, very bold and very exciting. And it's actually, although the big society, David Cameron's big society, is much derided now, and he doesn't even claim the credit, he doesn't claim any credit for it. Actually, what's happened is that he has made, through Michael Gove and through the education department, an attempt to give society an opportunity to step in and deliver education under the supervision of the state. And if you look at now what is happening across the world, that is starting to happen in other countries. And ARC, we are trying to assist African governments do the same thing with their. So in Liberia, we have basically advised the Liberian government, who have contracted out their entire education system to voluntary and, in their case, also for-profit providers who are going to come and replace the state under the supervision and funding and management of the state. And I think that's going to go much, much, much further. And it'll probably come into health, it'll come into all children's homes, Jeremy Corbyn called for the nationalisation of children's homes last week. Children's homes are a disgrace in this country, an absolute disgrace. But is nationalisation the solution? I don't think so. I think it's the voluntary sector that's got to step in and take over children's homes under the supervision of the state. So what are the problems with this? What are the risks that might be incurred? First of all, there is what has been called the corrosion of charity. I was very influenced. About 20 years ago, I read a think tank piece by a think tank called Civitas called The Corrosion of Charity, and they described how the charitable sector having been really thriving until the kind of the 60s, had been completely corroded because the state came in and became the dominant funder of most charities. And as a result of that, a lot of the charities lost the energy and the impetus because they became reliant on the state. And we've seen, you could argue that the Kids Company saga is an example of the corrosion of charity, where a charity effectively came to be dependent on the state money and didn't have the internal dynamics and accountability to make it to work properly. And it's very easy for charities to get lazy if they rely on the state. And of course, this is a big risk for the education sector. This great revolution that's happening started with a huge amount of new energy coming into the sector. It could be that in 10 or 20 years, that energy dissipates, the idealism goes, and people say, well, I'm sitting here, I'm running my chain of 30 schools, I've got state money, I don't need to worry about anything, and it just dribbles away. So what somehow you've got to keep is the energy and the idealism and the altruism that started this going. And you do that through mechanisms of accountability, very, very strong accountability, and through a constant, by injecting the risk that your franchise is taken away from you. In the American charter school movement, they're called charters because they're only given for 7 years. If you screw up, your charter's taken away from you. In the UK system, there is no such thing, which is a shame, because actually we should all be frightened of losing responsibility for the children if we don't do it well at the moment. And so there's a risk in the UK that we get lazy and that the impetus fades. Second risk is lack of capacity. If we're going to have this great philanthropic revolution, where's the capacity? The voluntary sector in the UK, there are total number of workers is 170,000. Not very many. It's about 3% of the workforce. And if you think about just the number of school governors you need if you had every school there are 30,000 schools. Each school has 8 governors. You need 240,000 governors just to have a properly populated governance system in education. So we need, for philanthropy to work at scale, we need huge amount of capacity, and that's another thing that we're trying to do. Obviously, the Marshall Institute is not remotely going to generate that kind of capacity, but we are going to try and generate leaders in the sector, and leadership will be absolutely critical, and provide inspiration to bring in the capacity that you need for it to work. Third risk, and the last risk I want to talk about, is political backlash. One person in particular did not like philanthropy. Charity degrades him who gives more than him who takes, treads the downtrodden still deeper in the dust, which demands that the degraded, the pariah, cast out of society, shall first surrender the last that remains to him, his very claim to manhood, shall first beg for mercy before your mercy deigns to press, in the shape of an arms, the brand of degradation upon his brow. And then, I'm going to read all of this, but he basically thought that philanthropy was the tool of the bourgeoisie to control the proletariat. And because he wanted antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, he wanted the proletariat to rise up, throw off their shackles, he didn't trust philanthropy at all. And to some degree, philanthropy can be very paternalistic. This is where Marx was right. But philanthropy becomes paternalistic, condescending, and doesn't lift up and equip people for life and for dignity, then it does fail. But that strand of political thought is very much alive and well, and you could easily see a political backlash against philanthropy and social entrepreneurship if it is not done well. But I want to finish on a brighter note than that. No philanthropist has perfect motives. No philanthropic solution is the perfect solution. No philanthropic or charitable activity is perfectly executed, because we're all fallible. But doing philanthropy and charity is the most fulfilling thing you can do. And as you do it, it changes you. And as you give, even if you start giving without great feelings of heart, what happens is that your concern and compassion grows through the giving. And I'll leave you with the words of somebody who Karl Marx would have disapproved thoroughly, Francis of Assisi. It is in giving that we receive, and that is ultimately what it's all about.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul. It's wonderful to move from Ayn Rand to Sir Francis of Assisi. I think that's a terrific trajectory, which very nicely captures a lot of what you were saying. We are open for questions. I will, if I may, abuse my position as chair by starting by asking a question about, and I suppose it's a question, two actually. One is about motivation. And there's a standard phrase, be just before you are generous. And the idea is that you should make people, you should give people what they deserve, what they merit. They should get what their rights are. And then the next stage is compassion. When you are generous to somebody, give them more in some sense than they deserve or what they right. And it struck me that was not dissimilar to your distinction between charity and philanthropy. That the philanthropist, in some sense, is working for people's rights. That is moving towards trying to to give people essentially what they ought to be getting, and that the state or the market is not providing for one reason or another. Whereas the charity is stepping in to help the needy and the compassion. I don't know whether you have thoughts on that. The second point, which is quite different, just concerns about the question about the voluntary sector and in education, or more generally relying on the voluntary sector to provide public services. There is a standard problem, which is that the voluntary sector may well have its own agenda. And that may not be the same agenda as the state's agenda. Now, that could be a good thing in many ways, but obviously it can also cause problems. And of course, the standard one is the fundamentalist religious school, which can create a wider problem. Do you think we ought to guard against that in some way?
Two very, very big questions. First, on the question of rights, I went through that talk without reference to rights. And I have to, some of you will probably have a rights-based approach to the way you do these, you think about charity and philanthropy, and that's entirely legitimate. It's not where I come from. I come from more of a sense of justice, which is a kind of older tradition. I think, the Judaic contribution to civilization was really an understanding of justice, really. And what gets me, I think we all actually get very, very upset by any notion of injustice as we see it. And I find the language of justice easier to use than the language of rights. But that's just me, and I don't profess to say one is superior, but it grabs my guts. Justice grabs my guts more than rights, because I think rights spills over into, somehow it goes into claims of entitlements which are well beyond what justice would ask for. On the question of the risk of charities going, or voluntary organisations going beyond their remit or beyond what they're allowed to do, that goes to the question, in a way it's part of the question of corrosion of charity. It's also got the question of what kind of society do we want. My first answer is that you need very, very tough accountability. And Michael Wilshaw is a bit of a hero of mine, because he is somebody who is willing and successful in making himself very unpopular. He was extremely unpopular both with ministers, Secretary of State, people who appointed him, parts of the sector, because he woke up every day angry about what he saw as the injustice of children not being able to fulfill their potential. And he was just on a warpath every day to try and right what he saw as that injustice. And he did it in a very articulate and bold way. And more than the individual, though, it's the infrastructure around accountability. You cannot give charities a role in using state money unless there is very high level of accountability. And having worked, I worked as a non-exec in the Department of Education. I saw how easy it is for money. Basically, politicians can give away your money very, very easily. The level of challenge, if a minister decides that they want to give away some money to something on a little scheme that they like, and they've been, Camilla Kids Company in her multicolored dress and her photo opportunities persuaded all these ministers to part with your money and for her charity. And she did it mainly through the power of the media and photo opportunities. And the civil servants don't stand up to the ministers, and there isn't the level of accountability in significant sectors that gives you that transparency and that challenge. So that's one aspect. And then there's a second aspect. You ask about faith schools, which is a very, very difficult question where I flip-flop because I on the one level I think faith is an incredibly important part of the motivation for people to do good things, and I also think that communities of faith are kind of at the heart of good stewardship of communities and of schools often, and the faith-based schools often have the best results. On the other hand, I do believe that as a society we have to make sure that there is a consistency in what is taught in all our schools and that it supports the values of this country. So that's a bit of a floppy answer, but it's
probably where a lot of us are, actually, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're open to questions or queries. There's one at the back there, yes. There are microphones coming.
Hi, I have a question about this kind of transition that you imagine from state provision to sort of voluntary sector provision. Do you have any ideas around how that transition could happen and sort of how to incentivize the voluntary sector to take up like quite big roles? For example, running a school is quite big responsibility. So do you have any ideas about how that transition might be facilitated?
You have to, the way it happened in this country, which is not the same as the States. In this country, the state actually provided quite a large financial incentive, not in terms of giving anybody money, but they matched charitable dollars in terms of rebuilding schools or particularly in rebuilding schools. And then after about 5 years, they phased that out. So there was initially a kind of financial prestige type incentive. And then it's become simply that they provide the guarantee of the running costs for the life of the school. So then they run into problems of capacity. How do they get enough sponsors of schools and enough good sponsors to really to be able to deliver. And I think that it's very difficult because you can't base it on money. So you are left with, I think, national leadership and a creation of values and honouring the work that is done. So the honours system, which is often abused, actually its role should be particularly to reward people, teachers, nurses, doctors in caring professions who are heroes, but are often not recognised by society. And so I would be much more generous with the honours system for the people out there on the front line. And I would also, you just need national leadership. You need Prime Minister, ministers to be constantly standing up and acknowledging the work that people do in the front line. But it's about creating a national climate where the Vice-Chancellor of a university or the head of a business says, you know what, this is what I should do with my spare time. This is what I should do with my capacity, my energy. I should do this. And that's about leadership. It's very difficult to craft something institutionally other than what they've done.
Michael, do you need a microphone? Cheers, thanks. Hello. I was wondering, I'm not sure if it's actually fitting exactly, but your opinion on social entrepreneurship, social impact investing in that regard, maybe even specifically for that capacity problem that you were talking about.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that because I didn't talk about it, and it's actually something which is very close to Tom and my heart. And that one of the motives for doing the institute was to create a place and a framework where we could attract and equip social entrepreneurs. I believe that in my generation, when I was your age, people wanted to go into the city. Florence was with me at business school. Well, actually, people wanted to make money. They wanted to create a business. Very few people wanted to be social entrepreneurs. My sense is a lot of people of your generation want to be social entrepreneurs, and that is just amazing. And that's a new thing. And so what we've got to do is to provide the funding and the infrastructure to allow you to do that. So one of the things we want to do at the Institute is to create an incubator, a bit like Dragon's Den. So a Dragon's Den for social entrepreneurs, where we'll bring together 5 or 10 billionaires once a quarter, and or even more frequently, and they will provide the funding, and they will select 1 out of 5 of each of the people who pitch to them. You have to pitch the business, the model, the business model, the vision, a pitch that explains how you get to sustainability, what problem you're solving, how you're solving it, all of the skills you need to create a business applied to social entrepreneurship. And my dream is that people like you and lots of people in your generation transform society because you apply the same energy to that as people applied to finance or to Silicon Valley. Because there are more opportunities to solve in the social entrepreneurship area than there are in the tech world. You use tech to solve problems. It's just unlimited the difference you can make.
Yes, there was somebody over here. Yes.
I had a question regarding the sector in which you think that social entrepreneurship could have a limit with regards to the providing of a given service by the state or not. I mean, let me rephrase my question because I realized it was not really clear. I think that it's one thing, for example, to talk about education and providing education in the voluntary sector, but it's another one altogether to speak about, for example, housing in our societies, in countries where more than 60% of the people live in informal settlements, and in which if you start to rely in this sort of way on voluntary work, you're going to end up not really giving the people the service that they require, which is housing. So do you believe that apart from housing or other sectors, I mean, you could have a limit to where voluntary work and social entrepreneurship could be applied to solve social problems?
So housing is definitely more difficult because it's so capital intensive and you need a lot of capital. And I'm going to bring Tom in a second to talk about health. But I think there are lots of sectors where you can make a massive difference. The most obvious is the elderly and the whole crisis in social care. So we have millions of people who are lonely, alone, days, weeks on end, and nobody's caring for them. And there are millions of other people who would care for them if they were organised. If you look at the churches in this country, most of them are full of people over 50 who meet together every week and actually quite like company, but who don't actually get out very much as they could, into their community and bring in all these, or just reach out to the people who are lonely. So I think that's an example of a sector where you could have a transformational impact if you started to really harness energy. Children's care and children's homes. There's another one. In children's homes in this country, I can't remember how many there are. There are about 400 or 500 children's homes. 67, according to the Inspectorate, 67% of children's homes in this country are rated inadequate. 67%. The number of schools is about 8%. 67%. It's an absolute abomination. And again, that could be social entrepreneurs. The charitable sector could come in and really make a difference there. Tom, you want to talk about the health briefly?
Sure. I'm Tom, Paul's co-founder, and I also chair 2 hospitals in West London. And I agree with everything you've said. I don't think there's any particular limit, and I would challenge on housing, because most of housing in this country for the last 70 years, a huge amount of the development has been led by housing associations, which is the same model as academies. It was really the government shifting the debt off the national balance sheet and transferring it to housing associations. I chaired a very large one for 5 years, and we ran it like a charity, and we looked after the people who are most in need. But in terms of healthcare, I'm in the middle of an extraordinary experience at the moment. I'm just launching a new organisation called Helpforce, which I've really sort of structured on the back of a fag packet. I shouldn't say that to the chairman of a hospital, actually. To support hospitals and GPs with a national network of volunteers. And I sort of dreamt this up about 16 weeks ago, and now I've been signed up by a total population of 10 million people in this country to underpin what's happening in NHS health and social care. So I think actually we are at a moment in time, which I wouldn't have said 5 years ago, when it's possible to dream Paul's dream, which is expanding beyond education into other areas. It's incredibly exciting. And by the way, we've got to do it because the state can't any longer.
Okay, something over there. Yes, and then first.
Hi, my question is: there was a report. Can you hear me? There was a like this.
Yeah.
There was a report by the Treasury a few years ago about the use of contractors by the government, and the Treasury questioned the value for money of using contractors. So my question is using the voluntary, why is using the voluntary sector a solution if contractors are not good value for money, and there is a problem, as outlined before, of aligning the interest of the states and the interest of the charity running these services?
I mean, I think there are value for money issues everywhere. There are value for money issues in the education. If you look at the academies sector, there are a lot of academies and academy chains that have not done a good job. And you know, every sector we're flawed. You know, we're all fallible. The school provision is varied. Contracting provision is varied. But I guess what I'm saying is if you can find people who are very motivated and energized and if they're competent, obviously that's an absolutely key condition, then they can uplift the quality of delivery, and that's what we need to do. And you know, I haven't worked as a civil servant, but I've been sat in the Department of Education for 3 years and watched how it works. And it just, when you're running very, very large organizations, you just cannot deliver in the way that you could if you had nimbleness, contestability, a term that was invented by one of the New Labour guys, contestability. Who invented that? Who was the first policy unit guy?
Well, Robert Hill or Andrew. It was before Andrew Adonis. It was.
The New Labour invented a term called contestability, which is a way of describing competitiveness in the voluntary sector. Because competitiveness was a bad word, but contestability means you can be able to contrast and compare. And what I'm saying is so good in education is that you can compare ARC with Harris, with ULT, and people actually put a microscope on each one and see which is doing better. So your point about contractors is absolutely right. We should be shining a light on every contractor, on every provider, through the accountability system, and we should all be learning from each other. ARC doesn't do everything perfectly. We're learning from people who do things better than us. And what you need to get is a system which is nimble, transparent, creative, and able to constantly evolve. And that happens not through a monolithic state provision, but through nimbleness and variety.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I wanted to ask on Maimonides, am I pronouncing it correctly? Maimonides, hierarchy of giving. Where would you locate your motivation for funding the Marshall Institute?
Shall I protect you from that question?
Yeah. So not very high, because I've allowed my name to be used. So it's vain. Yeah, quite right. So quite low. But I did start by saying we're all very fallible. So I clearly, if it was a perfect donation, I would have been completely anonymous. I completely agree with you. But everything else about it is good. Tom is great because he's kept his name under the radar screen, and the actual motivation and intrinsically what we're trying to do is wonderful.
Somebody right at the back there, I've been trying for a while. Yes.
Hello, thank you. I'm Zach, I'm in the MPA program. I wanted to ask, it was related to the previous question about your relationship with evidence. So hiring Nava to be a research director is a good first step, but beyond that, what do you think about how you evaluate either a previous program, the ones you talked about that you've done, or something in the future that you're going to implement? What standards do you look for a program you either give to or you're going to start? For example, Will McCaskill only has 6 programs in the whole world that he thinks are effective. And so do you only give to those programs? What makes a program worthy of donating or creating?
It's a great question. It's very difficult to generalize because other than in kind of rather simple jargon. You're looking for the maximum impact per pound, and you're looking for it to be sustainable. And I think that there's all the usual kind of impact, output, outcomes framework, which I'm a believer in, and doing that in the context of value for money. But the thing that I would emphasize, which is probably not as kind of conventional wisdom as that, is a sustainability point. It's really important to me in everything we do and everything we've done, for example, at ARC, and indeed at the Marshall Institute. I'm really obsessed with sustainability, about how do you make something which lasts not 5 years or 10 years, but 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. and makes a difference, and you make it future-proof. And not, I mean, again, nothing is future-proof, but you're trying to create something which is really sustainable. And then the other thing I'd mention, which is not directly an answer to your question, but in terms of criteria up front, what I would look for is leadership. Over the years, I've come to the realization that finding the best, a fantastic, outstanding leader is the single most important reason for the success of anything. And Lucy in ARC, for example, Lucy's leadership has been the driver of ARC success. And if you can find an outstanding person, you've got to back them. And how do you know somebody's outstanding? They've got to have a track record. So, you know, when David Moyes was appointed to succeed Alex Ferguson, it was a disaster. The guy had no track record of running a proper football club. And so I was violently opposed to David Moyes' appointment. I was perfectly all right with Van Gaal and Mourinho, but not David Moyes. And because you've got to know that somebody's got a track record, a measurable record of success. And that means that I'm slightly reluctant to back somebody very early unless they demonstrate through the process a great business plan and a vision and an understanding, because they've got to prove themselves.
I should say that one of Paul's major criticisms of senior people at Marshall is that they know nothing about football. But
particularly Julian.
I gave you good advice last time. In the end of that. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. I have a question about your model, something that maybe you haven't envisioned, but I wonder if you think there's any future role for philanthropic contributions to actual governments, especially given that many of the largest philanthropic funds today, their funds are derived from capitalistic ventures that have benefited immensely from low taxation rates. So do you envision a future in which charities actually donate to governments to pay back some of the significant tax reductions that they've benefited from in the past?
Good question. You remind me of one of the best Maimonides examples, which was Stanley Baldwin. Of course, he wasn't a rich man, but he was he was the son of a wealthy family who made a very large donation to the British government in the 30s of his own money anonymously, and then was found out about 5 years later. But I'm not aware of that happening today. I do agree with the sentiment of your question, because I do think that a lot of the wealth that has been made too easily and often with the help of mistakes by government. However, I would not personally give to the government. Because first of all, they already take a large amount of my money every year anyway. And secondly, they already have nationalised giving through the overseas aid budget. So they already, it's the only country in the world where we have to take that much money through taxation for giving. And thirdly, because having seen them at work, I just think it's not as good a means for giving as, I'd rather give it to Bill Gates. Bill Gates gives money incredibly effectively. He's transforming Africa. He's transforming the health of Africa. He looked at the problems that governments have known about for 40 years, right, of malaria. Take malaria. He looked at that problem. 40 years, governments, through the UN, through the World Bank, through EU, give money. Where do they give the money? Government to government. So they give them to dictators, and the dictators put them in their pockets. Bill Gates didn't do any of that. Bill Gates says, here's a problem, I'm going to solve it. Malaria, I'm going to do an immunization program for malaria across the whole of Africa. Polio, he's doing it. Why didn't the governments do that for 40 years? So I do believe that actually some very smart people, they are not subject to the same temptations as governments in terms of having their motives corroded by virtue signaling or political capture and so on, which cause the money to be ill spent. So the bottom line is I wouldn't do it myself, but I do understand where you're coming from.
Yes.
Thank you. Going back to your point about variety and contestability as the drivers of kind of efficiency, if we could imagine a world of, say, state schools where every principal just had the right personality to take that same kind of approach of contesting and improving and learning from each other, would that be similarly effective, hypothetically, to the academy system, or is there something that the institutional change adds besides bringing in kind of different people in those positions?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because
well, I think if you have the why couldn't one have a load of inspirational leaders employed by the state?
By the state.
In a normal system, rather than having to have one. Is that correct? That's what the...
Yeah, or if that did happen, would there be still something different than what we're moving towards with the academy system?
I think you could have it in theory. That sounds right, but we tried that for 100 years. And you had a mechanism of accountability. The mechanism in this country was effectively the local authorities were in charge of the schools in their area. And then the schools had their head teachers. And everybody was very well intentioned. But the local authorities who were in control, and I saw this at first hand, knew jack shit about it. Well, the people who were taking the decisions, which were councillors, knew jack shit about education. And they were taking the decisions. I saw it in my local borough is Richmond. And they just didn't know. They were, these young people coming in, elected councillors, making all kinds of decisions for political reasons rather than for the good of the children. So for me, it's been tested and failed. I mean, and a local authority-based system should anyway be better than a monolithic system like the NHS, which is national, but it's because it should have some contestability between local authorities. And maybe if you used information well enough, you could set up enough contestability between local authorities. There are some local authorities that have been very good, like Tower Hamlets has been very successful as a local authority in education, but other ones are just a disaster. And there was no way of moving that. So Knowsley now hasn't got a single child going to university. They've just crapped their last sixth form. It's near Liverpool. Imagine if you're born in Knowsley. I mean, no chance. So that wasn't working. Actually, as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't mind if you kept the really good local authorities, which are proven to be good, and they were competing with the really good chains. That's fine. And if they have a local-based... but what I do know is that sole state provision just didn't work.
Okay, there's a case over there.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about philanthropy in general. And this week the Oxfam report came out saying that about 8 people own more than half of the total world population. And my question is that, isn't philanthropy a sign that our society is in general very unequal? And wouldn't it be more important to reduce this inequality rather than relying on the philanthropy of rich donors who, well, decide what they want to give money to?
Well, I think it's not either or. I think it's both and. I think that obviously, in terms of income inequality in this country, as you know, in the last 20 years, it's actually improved, and inequality is reducing on an income level. But in terms of wealth, the inequality is outrageous. And the Davos is meeting this week, cozy club of central bankers and big business people who basically fixed the global financial system so that the rich get richer. QE, quantitative easing, is the most effective way of making the idle rich even richer that's ever been invented. And that, for me, is a major reason why we have so much backlash today, and it's a major problem. But I don't think the solution is only to just take the money from the rich and give it to other people. because we already have fairly progressive taxation. I think so, but I think you could do more. I think you've basically got to get rid of QE, or you've got to change this particular form of monetary financing to something which is much less unfair. But I also think, I don't think it's a choice. Alongside that, I think those who are rich, have a responsibility to make a very big contribution, and in a way that Bill Gates has done. And I hope everybody, all of them, contribute, and they don't, obviously, but I hope that more and more do, to really make that money work effectively. That's how they'll be remembered. You know, if they want to be remembered, it'll be because they made a difference to society and to justice.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Hi there. You talked of your admiration for Sir Michael Wilshaw, and one of the areas he's emphasised in the education sector is a need for leadership, because as he sees it, there's a serious lack, and there needs to be training to help improve head teachers, etc. How much do you see a need for this in other sectors that require social entrepreneurship, and how can this be done?
Great question, and Lucy is doing a huge amount of work at ARC we have various leadership programs at ARC to train up young leaders, and it's needed in every sector. And one of the key things is to make it easy for young people to become leaders very, very quickly. Because one of the major problems around leadership is that everybody feels you have to wait till you're 50 and got grey hair before you're given a leadership role. And our flagship school, in the sense that it's the best performing school, the head teacher, Max Heimendoff, is 30 years old. That's King Salomon Academy. It was the best performing secondary school in the country, bar none, in the public sector, in the last 2 years. And the guy's 30 years old. And that's fantastic. And so we've got to get rid of this kind of ageist culture, which are particularly prevalent, I'm afraid, in the state sector, and break it open. Just like also, by the way, there's far too much emphasis on the amount of time you have to take to get your qualification in a lot of professions. And I mean, you do need qualifications, absolutely, but it should be done very quickly, and it should include hands-on training. Something else we're doing at the Institute is getting people out into the voluntary, into charities to work, and philanthropic organizations to actually get experience. But combine experience with theory, and then fast-track people. But get people into leadership positions at the age of 35.
I think we've got time for one more question. There's somebody at the back there who's been trying to get in for a while.
It actually follows on really nicely. So earlier you spoke about one of the reasons you set up this institute, and one of the things you really want to do is to support young people in social enterprise, and therefore set up an incubator. And one of the key things about being a young person is that you haven't had a lot of time, you haven't got a track record because you spent your life in education. But completely in contrast to this, with your football example, you were talking about the fact that someone has to have a track record for you to trust them. And similarly with that head teacher, I assume that this was his first head teacher role. And so I guess my question is, when you start this incubator and you have young people who are 22, 23 coming to you, and all they've done is been at uni, and say, I want to start a company, how are you going to sort that dichotomy out in your head when what you trust is the track record, which they don't have?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I was aware of the slight contradiction when I was saying that, but obviously we recruit people at Marshall Wace who are kind of 23, 24. We would do it at ARC, 23. So not to run the whole thing, but to give senior important responsibilities to. And so if they have, clearly that you get 23, 24, 25, you can't have run something, but everybody has a track record. You have a track record. So whatever you've been doing, you have a track record. And so one looks for the attributes of leadership, which should be evident in everybody's life, and they include constancy, resilience, grit, drive, imagination. And if there's lots of evidence of that, and it survives the probing, then you know you've got the right person. And then it's remarkable how quickly people then deliver and build a real track record.
Well, I think on that note, I think we know that we have the right person here today. You have managed to deliver something that is provoking, stimulating, and actually quite inspirational. Thank you very much indeed, Paul.